Coyote Pass soon.
This is bull. I'm not selling this land until everything is perfectly fair and we do this the right way.
The courtroom, vast and echoing beneath its vaulted ceiling, seemed to hold its breath as Robyn Brown rose from her seat. The scrape of the wooden bench beneath her, a small but piercing sound in the cavernous silence. And as she stepped forward, the air itself seemed to bend around her presence. For she was not just another witness called to testify. She was the storm everyone had been waiting for. The lightning strike poised above the already fractured family narrative that had unraveled before judge, jury, and a gallery swollen with reporters, onlookers, and former friends who had come to witness either her redemption or her downfall. Each click of her heels upon the polished oak floor reverberated like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, though those who watched closely saw the faint tremor in her fingers as she smoothed the fabric of her blazer, as if she were trying to press the nerves flat into the material, willing them not to betray her. Yet even in that tiny gesture, there was a kind of dignity, a refusal to allow the world to see her completely broken. And when she reached the stand and placed her right hand upon the Bible, the light streaming through the tall arched windows caught on her wedding ring, a reminder of the bond at the heart of all this conflict. A bond that had once seemed unshakable, but now lay fractured on the floor for all to tread upon. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" asked the clerk in a voice sharp and perfunctory. And for a moment, the pause that followed seemed too long, too hesitant. Yet when Robyn finally replied, her voice, though quiet, carried an edge of determination. "I do." And as she settled into the witness chair, folding her hands tightly together in her lap, the judge gave a small nod, signaling that she might begin. And the hush that descended was heavier than any gavel strike, as though the very walls had leaned closer, eager to hear what this woman, vilified in tabloids and whispered about in family gatherings, would finally reveal. She drew in a breath, eyes flicking once towards Cody, who sat rigid at the defendant's table, his jaw set, his hands clasped before him in a grip so tight his knuckles were bleached white. And for the briefest instant, he looked at her with something like hope, a fragile thread stretched across the abyss between them. But she turned her gaze away, fixing it instead on some invisible point ahead. And when she spoke, the words, though soft, carried with them the sharpness of glass slicing through the air. "I know what they say about me. I know what the world thinks. I am the villain. The favorite, the woman who destroyed this family, the woman who came in and took what was never hers, but that is not the truth." It was never the truth, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. A rustle of shifting bodies, scoffs barely stifled. Even the scratch of pens across notepads sounding louder in the charged atmosphere. But Robyn pressed on, her voice gaining steadiness with each sentence. "When I married Cody, I did not do it to take from Christine or Janelle or Mary. I did not enter into this marriage to break apart what had been built before me. I married him because I loved him, because I believed in what he told all of us we were building, because I thought that this family, this dream was strong enough, big enough, loving enough to make space for me and for my children. And in those early days, it seemed as though it truly was. I was welcomed. I believed I belonged. But slowly, everything changed, and at this, her hands tightened further, the tendons in her wrists standing out, her eyes glistening, though she refused to allow tears to fall. They say I was given more, that I was the favorite, that I lived a life the others never had. But do you know how it feels to have your love turned into a weapon? To have everything you are painted as proof of someone else's suffering, as though your very existence is an act of cruelty. I did not want more. I did not ask for more. I only wanted to be part of the family we promised each other." And here her voice cracked, just slightly, enough to pull at the air, enough to make even those predisposed to hate her pause for half a heartbeat. Yet almost immediately, the tension in the gallery rose again. Christine shifting in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Janelle scribbling something furiously onto a notepad. Mary's eyes narrowed with that mixture of pain and scorn that had defined her testimony earlier. And Cody himself looked as though he were holding his breath, terrified that if he exhaled, the fragile defense Robyn was building might shatter before it could truly take form. and the judge, expression carefully neutral, tapped a pen once against the bench before saying softly, "Proceed," which Robyn took as both permission and command, leaning forward slightly, her shoulders squaring, her voice lifting a fraction louder now, as though she were no longer speaking only to the court, but to the women whose testimonies had already painted her as a usurper. Christine, Janelle, Mary, each of them told their truth. And I will not say they did not suffer. I will not stand here and pretend their pain was not real. But I will say this, their pain was not born from me. Their pain was born from a system that asked us to share one man, to divide ourselves in ways no heart should ever have to endure. And perhaps I was naive. Perhaps I was foolish to believe that love could stretch so far without tearing. But I did believe it, and I gave myself to it fully. And for that, I have been condemned. And at these words, a journalist in the back whispered to another, the scratch of shorthand quickening, the courtroom vibrating with the collective tension of people desperate to know whether this woman was finally breaking open the truth or merely weaving another layer of deception. And Robyn's chest rose and fell as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff. Every breath a decision whether to leap or retreat. Her eyes flashing now with something more fiery than mere defense, as though years of silent accusation had forged in her a steel that no longer wished to remain hidden. And in that moment, though half the gallery saw a manipulator and the other half saw a scapegoat, no one could deny they were watching history in the making. The kind of testimony that would be replayed on evening broadcasts, dissected in tabloids, whispered about in kitchens across the country. And all the while, Cody Brown sat rigid, unmoving, a man whose empire of carefully spun stories now hung by the thinnest of threads. Threads held not in his own hands, but in those of the woman the world had painted as both his salvation and his destruction. And yet, even as Robyn's words hung in the charged stillness of that courtroom, there came a restless stirring, a subtle wave of disbelief that rippled from bench to bench. For Christine leaned forward, unable to contain the sharp breath that tore from her lips. And though the judge's gavel came down once in a crisp warning for silence, the gallery could not help itself, whispers spilling like smoke, curling in the air, "She's lying." Some hissed, "She's twisting it." Others muttered. And still there were those whose eyes softened with a reluctant sympathy. For Robyn's trembling hands and fierce eyes made her appear less the cold usurper and more the weary woman fighting to be heard in a story already written without her consent. She felt it all pressing in every stare, every note scribbled in the margins of notepads, every sigh and every smirk hand for a heartbeat she considered stopping. Considered shrinking into the chair and letting the weight of accusation crush her. But then Cody shifted only slightly, his cuff brushing the polished table as his gaze fixed on her with something like desperation. And it was that silent plea, that wordless tether between them, that forced Robyn to raise her chin, to let her voice harden even as tears glazed her eyes. "I will not be the villain of this story because it is easier to point at me than to face the truth," she declared. And her words landed like stones across the floor, uneven and heavy. The truth is that we all made choices. We all agreed to this life, and I did not force Christine to stay when she wanted to leave. I did not forbid Janelle from questioning. I did not silence Mary when she cried out, yet here I stand, painted as the thief who robbed them of happiness, when all I ever tried to do was build happiness of my own. And her voice caught here, faltered for half a heartbeat, but she pressed on, "Yes, Cody spent time with me, perhaps more than with them. But was that my crime, or was that his failing? Am I to be condemned because I loved him fiercely? Because I stood by him when the rest turned away? Because I believed when belief became too heavy for the others to carry?" And at this, the murmurs swelled into a low thunder. The jury exchanging looks, pens still scratching, and the judge's eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in the quiet recognition that this was no longer merely testimony. It was confession, defense, accusation, and plea all braided together, and Robyn's hands unclenched at last, her fingers splaying open on the wood before her as though she were laying bare not only her words, but her very pulse. And she continued with a fervor that seemed to draw the very oxygen from the room. I have been called manipulative, conniving, the favorite wife. But none of those words capture the nights I spent alone when he was gone. None of them capture the fear I felt when I heard the others whispering behind doors. None of them capture the way I taught my children to hold their heads high, even as neighbors sneered at them for being mine. None of them capture the way I swallowed my pride every time. I was told my presence was the reason someone else's heart was broken. Presence was the reason someone else's heart was broken. If being strong for the man I married is a crime, then let them write me guilty. But if standing here, telling the truth as I lived it, is worth anything, then let it be known I was more than their villain. I was a wife, a mother, a believer, and perhaps a fool. But I was never the monster they made me out to be. And as she finished, the courtroom swayed between silence and storm. The stillness of those too shaken to speak, and the restless rustle of those unwilling to accept her words. And for a long moment, the judge did not speak, the air hanging heavy with the weight of everything unsaid, until at last the opposing counsel, lips curled into the faintest of smirks, rose with papers in hand, the rustle sharp, deliberate, slicing the air, and his voice, smooth yet edged with disdain, carried across the chamber. Mrs. Brown, you speak of love, of belief, of suffering. Yet the records before me paint a rather different picture, don't they? Bank statements, property transfers, medical bills, all with your name entwined where the others were left in want. Tell us, were these two merely the products of a system? Or did you, in fact, enjoy the privileges while your sister wives endured the lack? And a murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Christine's eyes burning with vindication, Janelle's jaw tight, Mary's lips twitching into the faintest nod, and Robyn's breath caught in her throat. Her hands twitching against the polished wood, but then her eyes flashed. Not with defeat, but with a fire that startled even Cody, who blinked at her as though seeing her anew. And she leaned forward, her words sharp as glass. You call them privileges, I call them responsibilities. Yes, the accounts bore my name. Yes, the properties were in my keeping. But do you know why? Because he asked me. Because he trusted me. Because when the weight of this family grew too heavy for his hands, he placed it in mine, and I carried it, not for myself, not to bask in some imagined luxury, but because someone had to. And when the bills came, when the lawyers called, when the roof needed mending, it was my name they found. It was my hands that signed. It was my shoulders that bore the burden. If you would make me guilty for that, then I accept it. But do not call me thief when I was nothing more than the custodian of what others refused to touch. And though her voice shook, it carried echoing off the paneled walls, stirring the gallery into a frenzy of whispers once more. And for the first time since she had taken the stand, Cody's lips parted in something like, for though he had brought her into this fight as his defender, she had become something fiercer, something untamed, a storm that could destroy him as easily as save him. And the judge's gavel struck once, twice, the sound reverberating like thunder, demanding silence, commanding stillness. And as the echoes faded, the judge's eyes bore down on Robyn, not unkind, but with the sharp scrutiny of one who sees not only the surface, but the fractures beneath. And the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, breath held, waiting to see if Robyn would withstand the fire of cross-examination or crumble beneath it. For in that moment, she was no longer merely a wife on trial by proxy. She was the embodiment of a family's fracture, a symbol of every whispered betrayal, every bitter night, every broken promise. And the outcome of her testimony would not only shape Cody's fate, but write the final chapter of a saga that had already scorched itself into the annals of public scandal. I loved Christine, she murmured, her voice almost breaking, her eyes seeking Christine's across the tense courtroom. I respected Janelle. I admired Mary for everything she endured and sacrificed. But when the storm began, when the foundations started to tremble, I became the simplest target. It was easier to cast me as the villain than to face the truth that Cody was already slipping away, that the cracks in this family had begun long before I ever arrived. Christine's eyes narrowed, a storm of hurt and fury flashing across her face. Janelle shook her head faintly, unwilling to concede Robyn's narrative. Mary sat utterly still, her expression carved from stone, silence screaming louder than words. Robyn sniffed, dabbing at her eyes, forcing composure. I did everything within my power to hold this family together. I defended Cody not because I was blind, but because I believed in him. I loved him. I thought that was what a wife ought to do. And Yesai remained at his side when others walked away. Tell me, does that make me selfish? Or does it make me loyal? Her tone sharpened, slicing through the courtroom air. They call it special treatment. But do you know what it truly looked like? It looked like me sitting alone with him, pleading with him to go and speak with his other wives. It looked like me reminding him that they needed him, begging him to try harder. Yes, sometimes he ignored me. Sometimes he only heard what suited him, but never did I tell him to abandon them. I begged him not to. The words hung sharp as glass. Some in the gallery exchanged skeptical glances. Others leaned forward, caught in the gravity of her defense. Reporters scratched furiously at their pads, pens racing to capture every flicker of emotion. Cody's eyes glistened. Pride radiated from him. For the first time that day, he looked vindicated, as though Robyn's words defended not only herself, but him as well. He nodded faintly, mouthing a silent thank you when her gaze met his. But Robyn pressed on. Her voice softened, heavy with exhaustion. I cannot change how I am seen. To many, I will always be the outsider, the intruder who shattered the harmony. But my truth is this: I love them all. I tried, and I am not the villain in this story. She drew a trembling breath. If blame is to be given, then let it rest upon all of us, upon me. Upon Cody, upon Christine, upon Janelle, upon Mary. This family collapsed not because of one soul, but because we all let go of the bonds that held us. The silence was suffocating. Eyes softened, others hardened further. The judge studied her, his face unreadable. Christine fumed. Janelle's skepticism burned in her eyes. Mary's expression remained inscrutable. And Cody sat taller, no longer cornered, but buoyed, as though his side had at last been spoken. Robyn stepped down at last, brushing a tear from her cheek, lifting her chin. Walking back to Cody, he clasped her hand, gripping tight. For the first time all day, he looked calm. The courtroom was not calm. The air buzzed, electric, trembling beneath the weight of her testimony. Christine had spoken with fire, Janelle with precision, Mary with a quiet, devastating strength, and Robyn with desperate loyalty. Now only one voice remained. The clerk rose. Cody Brown, please take the stand. The room held its breath. Cody pushed back his chair. The scrape of the legs sounded louder than thunder. He rose, adjusted his jacket, squared his shoulders as though stepping onto a battlefield. For years, he had been the one in command, the narrator, the showman, the orchestrator of image and story. But here, under oath, there would be no clever editing, no music, no spin. Only his voice, his truth, his version of it. He walked to the witness stand, heavy, deliberate steps. His once golden mane hung tired, his face less commanding. The cameras flashed mercilessly. He swore the oath and sat. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Brown, you may begin. Cody inhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. Christine, fire in her stare. Janelle, cold, unyielding. Mary, silent, devastating in her restraint. Robyn, tear-streaked and loyal, hands clasped. His children scattered in the gallery, some glaring, some refusing to meet his eyes. Finally, the judge. His voice, lower, carried defiance and fatigue alike. You think you know me. You've seen me laugh, rage, falter, seen me try to hold together a world larger than myself. But you do not understand the weight of it. To be husband to 4 wives, father to so many children, leader of something no ordinary man could sustain. I was human. I bent for Christine's discontent, for Janelle's independence, for Mary's loneliness, for Robyn's needs. But bend a man too far and he will break. Gasps rippled. Murmurs swelled. His voice rose. I gave everything, my labor, my presence, my strength, Yet every choice I made was thrown back as proof of favoritism. Yes, perhaps I did connect with Robyn more. Perhaps she saw me as the man I was. Does that make me a monster or a man longing, as any man does, to be loved? Christine hissed. Janelle muttered. Mary sat stone still. Robyn's eyes brimmed. Cody's voice softened, aching. You have judged me for years. Fans, tabloids, strangers who see only the character, not the man. I ceased to know where Cody Brown the father ended and Cody Brown the television husband began. Reporters scribbled furiously. The wives sat, taut, each emotion raw. Cody pressed on. I was not perfect. I failed, I faltered, but I never ceased trying. If that was not enough, then perhaps nothing ever would be. Gasps again. Christine slammed her palm, her fury breaking through. The courtroom shook. CodySmug.com now delivered his final blow. I am no villain. I am no hero. I am a man who attempted the impossible and paid the price. The silence was brutal. The air thick. The trial was not yet over. Evidence awaited, paper trails, bank records, deeds. But Cody's words, Robyn's defense, the wives' fire, all of it, now hung suspended in the air like smoke after battle. Now hung suspended in the air like smoke after battle. The lawyer representing Mary Brown rose with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the storm of tension already swirling within the courtroom. His footsteps echoing against the polished wood floor as though announcing not just his presence, but the gravity of the evidence he bore. And in his hands was not a great binder or an overwhelming archive of boxes and files, but a slimmer, deceptively modest folder, a file that seemed almost too small to carry the weight of what it contained. Yet the quiet confidence with which he placed it upon the lectern sent a ripple of anticipation through the gallery. For all present knew that the most devastating blows in a courtroom often came not with thunderous displays, but with precise, surgical cuts. His voice measured and deliberate, carried across the chamber with a sharpness that left no room for misunderstanding, Your Honor. Exhibit C, personal statements and communications regarding Mary Brown's ownership stake in the family businesses. Those words, plain as they were, seemed to strike like hammers upon the walls of the courtroom. For beneath their simplicity lay the long-buried truth of years of contribution and erasure. And as he began to outline the evidence, his tone did not rise with theatrics, but instead descended with the slow inevitability of a knife cutting through cloth. Mary Brown, he continued, contributed financially to several family ventures, including the early establishment of the family's first home, investments into businesses associated with the family name, and even the negotiations for the television contract that was meant to secure their livelihood for generations. However, and here his voice sharpened, records show her name was consistently excluded from the legal ownership documents. Her presence erased on paper as thoroughly as it had been in the affections of the man to whom she had given her loyalty. At these words, Mary's eyes filled with tears that glistened like fragile glass under the courtroom's harsh lighting. Yet she did not bow her head nor collapse into despair. She lifted her chin, holding herself with a pride that had cost her decades to preserve, though her heart clearly was breaking afresh. The lawyer pressed forward, his words like the tolling of a funeral bell. Furthermore, communications between Mr. Brown and his legal advisors reveal repeated discussions on how to phase Mary out of future financial dealings, despite her clear and undeniable contributions. The murmurs in the gallery became a wave of gasps, some sharp with outrage, others heavy with pity, and Christine, unable to restrain her empathy, reached across to squeeze Mary's hand, her own eyes brimming with fury and sorrow, while Janelle shook her head slowly. Disgust etched into every line of her face, and Robyn, sweet, trembling Robyn, looked horrified, though whether horrified at the revelation itself or at the mere exposure of their carefully guarded inner dealings was a question whispered but not answered. Cody, however, sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched, his face a mask that had long been perfected for cameras, now cracking beneath the merciless glare of truth. And though he tried to retreat behind silence, the blankness of his stare betrayed a man shrinking behind the crumbling walls of his own construction. The judge, solemn and unreadable, sifted through the files, turning page after page, his brow darkening with each revelation until at last he looked up. And the entire room fell into a silence so deep it was as though the very air had stilled in anticipation. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. But each word carried the weight of centuries of justice. The evidence presented raises serious questions about fairness, honesty, and intent. This court will review every detail carefully. But let me be clear, what I have seen today is deeply troubling. The strike of his gavel punctuated the words, and though it was only a small wooden hammer upon a block, it resounded through the chamber with the force of thunder, and the audience, as though released from a spell, exhaled in unison, gasps and whispers rushing to fill the void. Reporters scratched furiously at their pads, pens racing as headlines all but wrote themselves. Financial favoritism exposed. Coyote past secrets revealed. Mary erased from family records. Cameras clicked, capturing the faces of the wives as if these expressions would themselves become part of the historical record. Christine sat back, her tears drying but her spirit renewed, the faintest glimmer of vindication flashing in her weary eyes. Janelle's lips curved into the barest suggestion of a smile, not of joy but of bitter justice. Mary, though visibly broken, allowed herself the fragile comfort of relief. For at long last the truth she had borne in silence was no longer a secret to be swallowed in the night, but a reality acknowledged before the eyes of the world. Robyn's hands trembled violently as she clasped them together in her lap, her face pale and drawn, and though she looked horrified, there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of panic that betrayed how deeply she feared what might come next. Cody, by contrast, sat like a man carved from stone, motionless, expressionless, yet within him there was no calm, only the collapse of a tower he had thought invincible. His life's work reduced to paper trails and accusations, each one heavier than the last. But even as the atmosphere seemed unbearable, the air thick with revelation and despair, the clerk rose and announced that the children's statements would be read into the record. And the weight of the moment deepened, for while documents and bank records could sting, it was the words of children that promised to cut deeper than any contract or deed ever could. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the bailiff to bring him a folder of sworn testimonies. And when he glanced at the first page, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening slightly, as though he already sensed the devastation the words would unleash. Then he began to read aloud, his voice steady, but laden with the gravity of truths that would echo long beyond the walls of the courtroom. This is a sworn statement from Michael T. Brown, daughter of Christine Brown. A hush fell over the room as the judge's gaze swept across the chamber before returning to the page. Growing up, I saw my mother sacrifice everything for this family. She cooked, she cleaned, she raised children who were not even her own as if they were. And yet, when she needed support, my father often turned away. I remember her crying in the kitchen late at night, wondering how she would pay for things while Dad invested in Robyn's home. We children saw it. We felt it. It shaped us and it hurt us. The words seemed to burn themselves into the wooden walls, and Christine, trembling, covered her face as silent tears fell. Janelle leaned in close, gripping her hand with fierce solidarity, and even Mary's eyes brimmed with tears of shared suffering. While across the aisle, Cody shook his head sharply, muttering under his breath, "That's not true. That's not the whole story," but the microphones caught his protest, and the judge's piercing glare silenced him before he could say more. The judge did not pause for comfort. He turned to the next testimony, his voice unyielding. "This is a sworn statement from Garrison Brown, son of Janelle Brown." The room seemed to grow colder with each word. I watched my mom work 2 jobs while my dad spent most of his time with Robyn. My mom carried the weight of our household. My father often promised us things: college support, time together, family trips that never happened. When I tried to talk to him about it, he brushed me off, saying he had bigger responsibilities. But what's bigger than your own children? We felt abandoned. The faint scratching of reporters' pens was the only sound, and Janelle's lips quivered, though she fought to keep her composure, while Cody's fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. The mask of calm slipping further, and Robyn, horrified, whispered frantically into his ear, but he yanked his arm away, his face contorted with rage and shame. The judge pressed on inexorably. This testimony comes from Cody Brown, son of Christine Brown. His voice echoed the words, "My dad cared about control, not connection. He cared about appearances, not the reality inside the home. He could be charming for the cameras, but when the cameras were gone, so was he. My mom deserved better. We all did. I stand with her today because I refuse to let her sacrifices be erased." The statement cracked through the air like thunder, and murmurs spread across the gallery, some gasping in disbelief, others nodding grimly in recognition, while Christine's body trembled as if years of buried wounds were being ripped open. And she wept openly, unashamed of the truth that had at last been spoken aloud. But still the judge did not falter. This statement comes from Leon Brown, child of Mary Brown. The words were slower, heavier now, each syllable carrying the burden of years. "I grew up watching my mother be invisible. She gave loyalty, and in return, she was sidelined. My father rarely treated her as a partner. He diminished her, both in private and in front of his children. The emotional toll of that was devastating. My mom deserves recognition, not erasure. Mom deserves recognition, not erasure." Mary's hand flew to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as a sob finally broke through decades of silence. The sound raw and haunting, and even Christine and Janelle, hardened by their own wounds, turned toward her with tears in their eyes, silently offering their strength. Cody shifted uneasily, his mask slipping, anger and fear warring across his features. For now, his own children were the ones dismantling his carefully curated image, and there was no defense left to him. And then, as though to carve the final wound, the judge turned to the last statement, his voice now solemn with the gravity of what was to come. This statement comes from Janelle Brown, daughter of Christine Brown. The room braced. And then came the words, "I had a major surgery. My mother begged for support, but my father told us he was too busy. I remember lying in a hospital bed, waiting for him to walk through the door. He never came. That moment told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. I will never forget it. The gasp that erupted was louder than any before, a collective intake of breath that seemed to shake the rafters, and reporters froze mid-sentence, stunned into silence as Christine collapsed into sobs, her body racked with grief, while Janelle wrapped her arms around her like a shield. Mary shook her head slowly, reliving her own countless moments of abandonment, and Cody, red-faced, trembling, opened his mouth to speak. But the judge's thunderous glare silenced him before a word could escape. For once, Cody had no defense, and the courtroom, suspended in that brutal truth, held its breath. For the voices of children had cut sharper than any gavel could, leaving behind a silence thick with judgment and inevitability.